There are few figures in history whose lives ended in such haunting contrast to their beginnings. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who once commanded continents, who crowned himself Emperor of France, who redrew the map of Europe with a flick of his hand, ended his days not in a palace or battlefield, but on a small, wind-beaten island adrift in the South Atlantic Ocean. St. Helena, a place so remote that even the sea seems to forget it exists. A volcanic fragment surrounded by endless water, 6,000 miles from France and more than 1,000 from the nearest continent. It was here, in 1815, that the British government sent Napoleon after his defeat at Waterloo, not as a prisoner of war, but as a man erased from the world. The story of Napoleon's exile is not merely about power lost or glory faded. It is a story about isolation, the kind that stretches not only across oceans, but deep into the human mind. For years, Napoleon had lived surrounded by millions, soldiers, courtiers, rivals, and admirers. Now, his empire was reduced to a few rooms, a few loyal attendants, and the unyielding sound of the Atlantic wind. On St. Helena, the emperor who once ruled by movement and command was trapped by stillness. He could not roam, he could not lead, and he could not escape. But in that stillness, something strange began to happen. The line between history and memory, between genius and madness, began to blur. Was the island itself driving him to the edge, or was it the weight of his own reflection, the unbearable silence of a man forced to confront himself? To understand that, we must first understand the island, the place that swallowed Napoleon whole. Section 1. The island at the edge of the world. St. Helena is not a gentle place. Even today, ships that pass its rocky shores describe it as both beautiful and forbidding, an island that seems more like a wound on the ocean than a home for men. When Napoleon first saw it in October of 1815, after weeks of confinement aboard the British ship Northumberland, he described it as a prison without walls. It was not the grandeur of his past he saw, but the outline of his future. Jagged cliffs, violent waves, and the endless cry of seabirds circling the heights. The island itself was born of fire. It rose from volcanic eruptions millions of years ago, its peaks carved by wind and time into dramatic ridges and valleys. Vegetation clings stubbornly to the slopes, low shrubs, patches of fern, and the occasional twisted tree that grows sideways under the assault of the Atlantic gusts. The soil is thin, the rain unpredictable, and the landscape seems at war with itself. Green in one valley, barren in the next. The British had chosen it precisely for these reasons. St. Helena was isolated, defensible, and impossible to escape. After all, the memory of Napoleon's first exile, his daring escape from Elba, was still raw. The British would not risk another resurrection. If Elba had been a gilded cage, St. Helena was the coffin itself. When Napoleon disembarked, he was greeted not with ceremony, but with protocol. Governor Hudson Lowe, a man of cold efficiency and little imagination, awaited him. Lowe had orders from London: treat Napoleon with respect, but keep him under constant surveillance. He was not to leave the island, not to correspond freely, and not to receive visitors without permission. The emperor, the man who once controlled the fate of nations, would now have to ask for ink, paper, or even a walk beyond his garden. His residence, Longwood House, sat upon a damp plateau, open to the wind, and far from the island's small town of Jamestown. The house itself was modest, almost bleak, wooden walls that sweated with humidity, roofs that leaked in the rain, and a surrounding plain that turned to mud during storms. Napoleon found it both insulting and poetic. He called it the last step from the throne to the tomb. The first weeks on St. Helena were almost unbearable. The constant sound of the ocean, a deep, endless roar, filled the air like a heartbeat that would never stop. At night, the wind rattled the shutters and carried the scent of salt and decay. He often stood outside under the moonlight, staring toward the horizon where nothing but darkness stretched for thousands of miles. He would whisper to his aides, "France is beyond that sea," and then turn away, silent. But even here, his habits of order and control persisted. He arranged his days with military precision, reading in the morning, dictating memoirs in the afternoon, walking the grounds at dusk. He still dined as if in court, seated at the head of the table, speaking to his small retinue, Count Bertrand, Count Montholon, and the faithful valet Marchand, as though they were ministers of state. Every gesture reminded them, and perhaps himself, that he was still Napoleon, not a prisoner, but an emperor in exile. And yet, the island began its slow work upon him. There is something about St. Helena that changes a man. Its isolation is not passive, it presses inward. The wind does not merely blow, it listens. The mountains do not simply rise, they watch. And the sea, with its endless rhythm, becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting one's thoughts until they echo too loudly to bear. For Napoleon, who had once filled the world with his presence, the absence of everything was a kind of death. No more armies to command, no more dispatches to send. Only the dull repetition of days, the creak of floorboards, the scratching of pens, and the laughter of British guards beyond the fence. Here, on this lonely island, history began to dissolve into memory, and memory began to turn on him. Still, even in exile, he could not stop shaping his own legend. In long, drifting conversations with his companions, he began dictating his story, the campaigns, the politics, the betrayals. He painted himself not as conqueror, but as visionary, a man misunderstood by small minds and crushed by cowardice. He was already rewriting his place in history, using words instead of weapons. And perhaps that is how he began to survive, not through rebellion, not through escape, but through storytelling. Because for Napoleon, as for so many before him, the mind was the only empire left. Section 2. The Emperor in his Cage. Each morning on St. Helena began the same way, with silence. The island's mist would crawl up from the valleys and roll over the plains of Longwood, wrapping the house in a heavy, damp veil. From the distance, Longwood looked like a lonely ship stranded in a sea of fog. Inside, Napoleon would rise early, as he always had. Even now, far from the thunder of battle or the glitter of court, the emperor's day began with precision, a ritual of control, in a place where almost everything was beyond his command. He would dress carefully, choosing from the few uniforms he had brought from Europe. Green coats trimmed with gold, the old bicorn hat that had become his symbol, his black riding boots polished to a dull shine. These garments, now faded and worn, were more than clothes. They were fragments of a vanished world, a uniform of identity that declared, even here, who he was. He refused to be seen in anything less than imperial. He may have lost his empire, but he would not surrender his dignity. Breakfast was quiet. Napoleon sat at a small table near the window, sipping strong coffee and nibbling on stale bread, while scanning a few newspapers brought by British officers from the ships that occasionally docked at Jamestown. The news came late, sometimes months old, but he devoured every line. He read about the kings and generals who once trembled before him, now reshaping Europe in his absence. He read of France, his beloved France, governed by the Bourbons again, his name erased from public life. Each headline was a blade, cutting him away from the world he had built. And yet, he could not look away. When he finished, he would move to his study, a small, cluttered room filled with maps, books, and piles of paper. There for hours each day, he dictated his memoirs to his loyal companions, General Bertrand, Count Montholon, and sometimes even his valet, Marchand. His voice, once used to command armies, now filled the small chamber like a sermon to the past. He recounted his campaigns with vivid precision, the sweep of his cavalry, the smoke of cannon fire, the thrill of victory. He spoke of glory, not regret. To his listeners, it was as though he was trying to build a bridge from this damp island back to the grand theaters of Europe. He was not just remembering, he was shaping. He was rewriting history with himself as the tragic hero, betrayed by monarchs and undone by fate. In those hours, Napoleon seemed alive again, his eyes sharp, his gestures quick, his voice full of that same energy that once moved nations. He could forget the walls, the guards, the sea. But when the dictation ended, the silence returned, thicker than before. Afternoons were for walking. He would step outside into the wind, wearing a gray overcoat and wide-brimmed hat to shield himself from the harsh sun. His small entourage followed at a respectful distance. He rarely spoke. He walked along the same paths each day, across the dry plateau, past the grazing goats, and toward the edge where the cliffs dropped sharply into the Atlantic. There he would stop, looking out at the water, at the endless horizon that had become both his comfort and his torment. Sometimes he muttered to himself. Sometimes he simply stood still, letting the wind tear at his coat as if it were trying to take him with it. The British officers who watched him often remarked how strangely calm he appeared. Too calm, perhaps. They did not understand that for Napoleon, stillness was the hardest battle of all. He was a man built for motion, for conquest, for command, to live a life of repetition, of still days that all looked the same, was a kind of slow death. It was not the confinement of walls that destroyed him, but the confinement of time. Every sunrise was a reminder that nothing had changed. Governor Hudson Lowe, ever the bureaucrat, tightened the restrictions further. Napoleon's letters were censored, his visitors limited, his supplies rationed. The emperor's pride was a constant irritation to Lowe, and the two men despised each other. To Napoleon, Lowe was the executioner of my body, Too low, Napoleon was a manipulator, a dangerous mind even in defeat. Their relationship poisoned the air at Longwood. Every request for books, for better food, for permission to walk further, became a political battle. And Napoleon, denied even the small dignities of life, began to withdraw deeper into himself. At night, he would dine with his companions under the flickering light of candles. They would speak of France, of old memories, of family. Sometimes they would laugh, though the laughter never lasted long. Napoleon would reminisce about his mother, about Josephine, about the victories that once made the world tremble. And then, without warning, he would fall silent. He would stare into the darkness beyond the table, as though listening for something only he could hear. It was in those moments that his companions feared for him most. He began to sleep less. The island's wind seemed to haunt his dreams, whispering through the cracks in the walls. He told Marchand that he could hear the sea even when it was calm, a constant roaring in his mind, like the echo of distant drums. Sometimes, he said, he dreamed of marching again, of riding at the head of his troops, only to wake and find himself trapped once more inside Longwood's walls. He would sit up in bed, breathing heavily, the candlelight trembling across his face. "Even my dreams have limits now," he once murmured, but not all was despair. There were moments, brief, fragile moments, when the old spark returned. He would organize his small garden, instructing his attendants to plant flowers in neat rows. He would design new military strategies for imaginary wars, sketching plans across the table as if Europe still awaited his command. He even began studying English, though he often grew frustrated, declaring that the language was unworthy of an emperor. These small acts of discipline were his rebellion, proof that even in exile he refused to become ordinary. And yet beneath the surface, the erosion continued. The combination of isolation, tension, and the island's damp air began to weaken his body. He suffered from stomach pains, fatigue, and strange fevers. Doctors came and went, but the treatments, mercury, purgatives, endless bleeding, only made him worse. Still, he endured, driven by an unspoken defiance. He would not give the British the satisfaction of seeing him break. Not yet. To those who visited, Longwood seemed both a tomb and a stage. Napoleon played his role to the end, sometimes a ruler, sometimes a philosopher, sometimes a ghost. He once said to Montholon, "If I cannot rule the world, I will at least rule my legend." And perhaps that was what he was doing all along, transforming his suffering into story, his isolation into immortality. Because while the world had forgotten the man, it would never forget the myth. And the myth was being written here, one sentence at a time, amid the fog and wind of an island that felt farther from life than death itself. Section 3. The Emperor and the Island's Shadow. As the months on St. Helena stretched into years, Napoleon began to change in ways that even his closest companions could not ignore. The proud emperor, who had once dictated the fates of nations, now found himself pacing endlessly across the same few acres of wind-battered land. The rhythm of exile had carved itself into him, a slow, heavy pattern of repetition and remembering. But something else was happening too. It was as though the island itself was sinking its roots into his mind. St. Helena was unlike anywhere else on Earth. It was a volcanic shard rising from the middle of the Atlantic, surrounded by thousands of miles of ocean in every direction. There were no neighboring lands, no horizon that offered hope of escape. The winds howled almost constantly, shifting between humid stillness and violent gusts that rattled the shutters at Longwood through the night. The air carried the scent of salt, earth, and decay. Even the trees seemed to lean away from the wind, as though the island itself were weary of standing upright. Napoleon would sometimes stand outside, his arms folded behind his back, and stare across the landscape. He began to name certain rocks and paths: my plain, my valley, the Emperor's Cliff. He would point to a dark ridge and tell Bertrand, "That hill watches me." It wasn't said with madness, but with a strange tone of uncertainty. Poetic certainty, as if he had come to believe that the island was not just his prison, but a conscious companion, one that listened and remembered. Longwood House was falling apart. The walls leaked when it rained. The floors were warped and damp. Mold crept into his furniture, into the pages of his books, even into his clothes. The British authorities had promised improvements, but few ever arrived. The result was a house that felt half alive, breathing with the weather, groaning with each storm. Napoleon began to complain that the air was poisoned. Sometimes he said he could taste the rot in the water. He developed small rituals to fight the island's hold on him. Every morning he inspected his rooms like a commander inspecting troops. He would have the floor swept twice, the furniture adjusted, the curtains drawn open exactly halfway. Discipline, he told Montholon, is what separates man from despair. Even in captivity, order was his weapon. He arranged his books, Caesar, Plutarch, Tacitus, in precise stacks on his desk, returning them to the same place every night. The smallest details mattered. It was his way of asserting control over a life that no longer obeyed him. But beneath that order was growing unease. His letters to the outside world became sharper, filled with accusations that the British were trying to kill him slowly. He believed his wine was being tampered with, that his food was tainted. Once he refused to eat for 2 days, convinced that the governor had sent English poison. His servants reassured him endlessly, yet the suspicion lingered. The emperor, who had trusted no one in war, could not bring himself to trust anyone in peace. And yet, the British guards watching from a distance noted that Napoleon still carried himself with dignity. They saw him walking the paths in his worn green coat, his hat tilted just so, his hand tucked into his waistcoat, the same pose seen in countless portraits. But what they could not see was how thin he had grown, how his once bright eyes were dimming. The power that had once filled every word he spoke now came in bursts, like a fire that refused to go out but was running out of fuel. He began to talk more about destiny. To Bertrand he would say, "Do you think the world will remember me as a tyrant or as a savior?" To Montholon he confided, "If I had died at Austerlitz, they would have called me a god." Sometimes, when the wind blew hard enough to shake the windows, he would mutter, "It would have been better to die with the thunder of cannons than to rot with the cries of birds." But not every day was filled with bitterness. There were quieter moments too, moments that revealed the man behind the myth. He took comfort in simple things: the sight of the island's blue lilies after rain, the distant glimmer of the sea at sunset, the rare letters that arrived from his family in Europe. He would reread them by candlelight, tracing the ink with his fingers, as though touching the past itself. Sometimes he even laughed again. He would tease his attendants, recalling old jokes from his campaigns, or mimic the voices of long-dead generals. "Ah, poor Ney," he'd laugh, shaking his head, "always charging too fast." For a few fleeting moments, he became himself again, not the prisoner, but the man who had once held half the world in his hands. Then, just as suddenly, the light would fade, the laughter would stop. His gaze would drift toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like an uninvited guest. "They will forget me," he whispered once to Marchand. "History remembers victories, not prisons." There was another strange habit, one that worried his attendants. At night, when everyone else was asleep, Napoleon sometimes wandered through the darkened halls of Longwood. Marchand once found him standing at the window, barefoot, staring into the moonlit fields. "The sea glows at night," Napoleon said softly, "like the ghosts of all the ships that have passed me by." He was silent for a long time, then added, "Do you think the waves remember who I am?" It was hard to tell if he was dreaming or awake. Even when he returned to bed, he often spoke in his sleep, half-formed sentences, names of cities, commands shouted to invisible armies. The empire still lived inside his mind, replaying endlessly, like a grand theater he could never leave. His body was on St. Helena, but his soul was still marching through Europe. And as the years passed, those around him began to notice something uncanny. The line between the man and the myth was disappearing. Napoleon had become a story, one he was both living and telling at the same time. Every word he spoke, every memory he dictated, seemed crafted for the future. "I will die here," he said one evening, "but my ghost will not. My ghost will walk the earth, and they will speak my name long after the English are dust." In that moment, even his companions felt a chill, because it no longer sounded like arrogance. It sounded like prophecy. Section 4. The Emperor's Final Days. By the spring of 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer the man who had once commanded the world's armies. His body, worn down by years of damp air, confinement, and anxiety, had begun to fail him. Yet his mind, restless, searching, proud, remained sharp, flickering like a candle that refused to be extinguished. Those who cared for him often said it felt as though the emperor was wrestling not with illness, but with the island itself, as if Saint Helena were an invisible adversary, determined to break the last of his spirit. Each morning came quietly. The wind that had once screamed across the cliffs now seemed to sigh, as though tired of its own voice. Napoleon's routine became slower, more fragile. He would wake late, sometimes past 10, and allow Marchand, his faithful valet, to help him rise. He often complained of burning pain in his stomach and a strange metallic taste in his mouth. Some days he could not eat at all. The meals that once brought him a sense of control, arranged with military precision, the wine poured exactly halfway, now sat untouched. His doctors debated endlessly over what ailed him. Some blamed the damp climate, others whispered about ulcers, liver disease, even deliberate poisoning. Napoleon himself was convinced the English were trying to kill him. "They do not dare to hang me," he murmured once, "so they are letting the island do it for them." But beneath the suspicion lay something deeper: resignation. His pride remained, but it had softened, stripped of the grandeur it once carried. "I am no longer a general," he said one afternoon. "I am a shadow that remembers a man." Outside, the island carried on in its eerie stillness. The same seagulls circled the same cliffs. The same clouds rolled endlessly over the horizon. Yet those who lived near Longwood swore that something about the place felt different in those final months. The air seemed heavier, the silence deeper. The British sentries, hardened by routine, often spoke in hushed tones at night. Some said they could hear music drifting through the mist, faint echoes of drums or trumpets, as though Napoleon's ghost were rehearsing his final march before death. Inside Longwood, time seemed to dissolve. Napoleon spent hours at his desk, writing letters that would never be sent, dictating his memories to Bertrand and Montholon. He was determined that his version of history, not England's, would survive. "They will call me what they wish," he told Bertrand, "but they will not forget me." He spoke slowly, sometimes pausing to catch his breath, his once powerful voice now a faint murmur. In the evenings, he would ask to be carried outside, where he could watch the sunset from the garden. The light on St. Helena was unlike anywhere else, soft and golden, filtering through the mist in trembling patterns. It painted Longwood in a kind of ghostly beauty, as though the entire island were holding its breath. Napoleon often sat in silence during these moments, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He told Marchand once, "Do you see how the sea burns when the sun dies? That is how men should end, in flame, not in shadow." The valet did not answer. He knew the emperor had begun speaking less to others and more to himself. He dreamed often. Some nights he dreamed of France, endless parades, banners fluttering, the roar of cannon fire echoing across the fields. Other nights he dreamed of Egypt, of the golden sand and the whispering wind over the desert. But there were darker dreams, too. He would wake suddenly, drenched in sweat, whispering of waves, of ghosts, of faces in the fog. "The sea speaks to me," he said once. "It says that I am coming home." His health declined rapidly in April. His doctors prescribed tonics, bleeding and poultices, treatments as outdated as they were ineffective. Nothing helped. His body grew weaker, his legs swelled, and he began to drift in and out of consciousness. Even so, he continued to dictate. His last writings were not about power or war, but about memory. "Glory," he said softly, "is the perfume of heroes. It fades, but its scent never dies." His companions tried to keep him comfortable. They read aloud from books he loved: Plutarch, Ossian, Voltaire. He would close his eyes and listen, his lips sometimes moving as if repeating the words. But more and more often he fell silent. The storms outside grew louder, and the house seemed to shake with them. One night, as thunder rolled across the sea, Napoleon opened his eyes and whispered, "The cannons, they are calling me again." By early May, everyone at Longwood knew the end was near. Napoleon's breathing had become shallow. The room smelled of medicine and candle wax. His attendants kept watch day and night. At times, he would wake and look at them with clear, steady eyes. "France," he murmured once. "Army, Josephine." They were his final words of love and memory, wrapped together in one fading breath. On the evening of May 5th, 1821, as rain lashed the windows and wind howled over the cliffs, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, conqueror of Europe, exile of the Atlantic, died quietly in his bed. Marchand closed his eyes. The island fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Those who stood by him said that in his final moments, his face softened, not proud, not defiant, but peaceful, for the first time in years. The emperor looked as though he had found rest. After his death, the British officers entered the room. They stood in silence, unsure what to say. The man they had guarded, feared, and hated for 6 years was gone. Outside, the sea shimmered faintly under a pale moon. Some of the islanders claimed that for days afterward, the ocean around St. Helena remained strangely calm, as though mourning him. He was buried in a valley he had chosen himself, a quiet, shaded place filled with willows and ferns. The only sound was the wind moving gently through the leaves. His tomb bore no name, only a stone. The British refused to let it say Napoleon. They feared that even dead, he might still command allegiance. And yet, in the years to come, his legend only grew stronger. Pilgrims came to the island. Songs were written. His image, once banned, returned to Europe in secret prints and portraits. 2 decades later, his body was returned to France, carried in a grand procession through the streets of Paris. The crowds wept, not for the emperor who had ruled them, but for the man who had dreamed so greatly and fallen so far. They laid him to rest under the golden dome of Les Invalides, a place of honor, a monument to memory. But on St. Helena, The wind still whispers his name, and those who visit Longwood swear that on quiet nights they can hear faint footsteps in the garden, pacing as they once did, steady, deliberate, endless, because perhaps, in some way, Napoleon never truly left. Section 5. Whispers from the Island. When Napoleon Bonaparte died on St. Helena, the world seemed to breathe again, yet the island did not. Something remained, something quiet, invisible, and deeply unsettling. Longwood House, once filled with footsteps, murmurs, and the steady rhythm of imperial routine, became unbearably still. Even the servants, who had grown used to his moods and his long silences, now felt the emptiness like a weight in the air. It was as if the island had lost the heartbeat that had kept it alive. In the days following his death, the weather turned strange. For nearly a week, a heavy fog clung to the cliffs, rolling in from the sea like a shroud. Sailors anchored in Jamestown Harbor swore that their compasses spun erratically, and some said the waves around the island became unusually calm, eerily so, as if the ocean itself were keeping vigil. Others dismissed it as imagination, but even they spoke in hushed tones, unwilling to disturb the uncanny stillness. Inside Longwood, the British officers were uneasy. They had always feared Napoleon, even as a prisoner. He was a man who commanded loyalty through presence alone, through the weight of his stare, the measured tone of his voice, the aura of certainty that surrounded him like armor. Now, without him, the walls seemed to echo faintly with that lost authority. Marchand, his valet, refused to sleep in the house. He claimed that each night he could hear the sound of boots pacing the floor above, slow, deliberate, rhythmic, like a man deep in thought. Others heard it too. Soon, tales began to spread across the island. Local settlers spoke of lights flickering at Longwood in the dead of night, bluish glows that drifted between the windows, then vanished into the mist. One British guard, stationed near the gate, swore he saw a shadow pass by and raise its hand in salute. When he looked again, there was nothing there but fog. Superstition grew quickly on St. Helena. For centuries, sailors had called it a cursed island, a place of isolation and restless spirits. Now, with the emperor buried in its soil, the legend deepened. Some said the ground itself would never allow him peace, that he still wandered, seeking the Europe he had lost. Others believed the opposite, that his presence blessed the island, giving it a strange protection. Indeed, in the years following his death, no shipwrecks were recorded near the southern cliffs, and storms that struck other parts of the Atlantic seemed to skirt St. Helena entirely, as though guided by an unseen hand. Visitors who came years later reported an undeniable feeling as soon as they arrived, a stillness that pressed on the chest, not heavy, but haunting. One traveler described it as the quiet of a cathedral after the last prayer. Even today, the wind on St. Helena carries a peculiar tone, low, constant, almost melodic. Locals call it the Emperor's breath. The British tried to erase the legend. They dismantled parts of Longwood, replaced the furniture, and sealed away personal items. Napoleon's death mask was taken away, his journals shipped to Europe, his loyal servants sent home. Yet the more they tried to bury his memory, the stronger it became. Soldiers who had once guarded him now found themselves unable to forget. They wrote in their letters of dreams in which they saw him, standing on a hill overlooking the sea, his coat flapping in the wind. He never spoke, they said. He only turned, as if waiting for orders that would never come. Some even believed his influence lingered in the island's strange luck. Crops grew unexpectedly well in the years after his death. Rain came exactly when needed. A sailor once joked that the emperor still manages the weather, and though people laughed, no one entirely doubted it. The islanders had come to think of him not as a prisoner, but as a kind of guardian spirit, fierce, tragic, eternal. The French eventually sent envoys to maintain his grave. They trimmed the willows, swept the path, and left fresh flowers on the stone. Each evening, they would stand quietly by the tomb, hats removed, listening to the wind rustling through the ferns. They said it felt like being in the presence of something immense and sorrowful, not a man, but an idea that refused to die. Sometimes, a faint scent of violets would drift through the air, Josephine's favorite flower, though none grew anywhere near the site. To those who tended his resting place, it was a sign. The emperor remembered love, even in death. But perhaps the strangest story came from a British sailor named Thomas Reeve. Years after Napoleon's passing, Reeve claimed that one night while stationed near the coast, he saw a figure standing on the cliffs, small, upright, silhouetted against the moon. It wore a long coat that fluttered in the wind. Reeve called out, but the figure did not move. He turned away for a moment to signal a companion, and when he looked back, it was gone. The next morning, when he visited the spot, he found footprints in the damp grass, leading toward the sea and stopping at the very edge. Reeve never spoke of it again, except once, when he said quietly, it was him. He was still looking for France. Over time, the island began to change again. The British soldiers were replaced, the fences repaired, and the graves overgrown. But Longwood remained haunted, not by fear, but by memory. The wallpaper faded, the furniture decayed. Yet the air still carried the weight of a story too vast to fade. When visitors walked through the house, they described an inexplicable feeling of being watched, not with hostility, but with curiosity, as though the old emperor were measuring them, deciding whether they were worthy to stand where he once stood. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows from the sea and the stars hang low over the Atlantic, the people of St. Helena still tell their children, don't go walking by Longwood after dark. The emperor doesn't sleep. It is said that if you stand quietly by his grave, you might hear footsteps on the path behind you, slow, firm, unmistakable. And if you turn around, there will be no one there, only the sound of the wind, moving gently through the willows, whispering in a voice that seems to say, I am still here. ... Section 6. The World Without an Emperor. When news of Napoleon's death finally reached Europe, it moved slower than one might expect for the passing of a man who had once ruled nearly all of it. The message crossed the sea on a ship that rocked gently in the Atlantic, carried by sailors who knew they were bearing history in a sealed envelope. By the time it reached London, the world had already changed, and yet in many ways it hadn't changed enough. There were no grand bells tolling, no sudden silence across the capitals of Europe. Instead, there was a strange kind of quiet curiosity. People who had feared him, cursed him, fought him. They paused for a moment and then carried on. But in private corners of the continent, in drawing rooms and barracks, in fields and among the poor, a whisper began to grow. The emperor is gone. To some, it was liberation. To others, it felt like the end of an era that had given their lives meaning. For nearly 2 decades, Napoleon had been the axis around which Europe turned, a storm that pulled every nation into its winds. Now, the storm had passed, leaving only the memory of thunder. The British newspapers were cautious. They published his death almost reluctantly, placing it beneath shipping schedules and government announcements. There was no triumph in the tone, only fatigue. The war had been won long ago, but his name still carried a strange power, as if writing it too boldly might somehow call him back. In the streets of London, the news was met with murmurs and shrugs. But in France, it was different. France did not know how to mourn him. Officially, he had been an outlaw, a traitor to the restored Bourbon monarchy. Yet, for many Frenchmen, he remained l'Empereur, the man who had turned their nation into something magnificent and terrifying all at once. In secret gatherings, veterans of the Grande Armée raised their glasses to his memory. Women who had lost sons whispered prayers for his soul. And among the young, a strange kind of nostalgia began to bloom. Nostalgia for a man most of them had never seen, but who had somehow made France feel larger than the world. In cafes, poets and philosophers spoke of him in near mystical terms. They said his death on a distant rock was the price of greatness. They compared him to Prometheus, the man who stole fire from the gods, only to be chained forever as punishment. It was a comforting myth, one that turned defeat into destiny. Even his enemies found themselves haunted by it. The Duke of Wellington, who had beaten him at Waterloo, admitted years later that he felt a strange void in his absence, as though the world had lost its direction. In the countryside, stories spread faster than the truth. Some said he wasn't really dead, that the British had faked his death to keep him from returning again. Others believed that he had escaped and was living quietly somewhere in South America, waiting for the right moment to rise once more. There were even sightings of a man in a gray coat, standing by a riverbank or walking through a foggy forest. People wanted to believe, because if Napoleon could return, then perhaps the glory of the past could too. As the years went on, his image softened. Painters began to depict him not as the conqueror, but as the dreamer, sitting alone on a rock, gazing toward the horizon. Romantic writers turned him into a symbol of human ambition, of the eternal struggle between destiny and desire. Victor Hugo wrote that Napoleon was not a man, but a century walking. The idea of him began to outgrow the man himself. Meanwhile, the real world tried to rebuild. The old monarchies returned to power. Drawing borders and rewriting history. They wanted to erase the memory of revolution and empire, to restore the calm of the past. But they could not erase the fire that Napoleon had left behind. Young men across Europe dreamed not of kings, but of heroes. They read about his campaigns, memorized his quotes, and whispered his name in secret as a symbol of rebellion. Even in death, he remained a challenge to authority. A ghost that the crowned heads of Europe could never quite silence. In Paris, a strange ritual began to take shape. Each year on May 5th, small groups of people would leave flowers on bridges and street corners. No one organized it. No one claimed responsibility. But every year, the flowers returned. Lilies, violets, laurel leaves. Each one a quiet message. We remember. Police tried to stop it, but they couldn't. The memory of Napoleon had become untouchable. A religion of its own. Years passed. The world moved on. Railways crossed continents, steamships conquered oceans, and Europe entered an age of invention and empire. But even as time marched forward, the myth of Napoleon lingered, not in the halls of power, but in the imagination of ordinary people. His shadow stretched far beyond his life, beyond the wars, beyond the exile. He had become a legend, one that refused to fade. When decades later, his body was brought back to France under the reign of Louis Philippe, the scene was unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. Crowds lined the streets of Paris. Tears fell from faces both young and old as the coffin passed, draped in imperial colors. It was as though France itself was welcoming home a lost soul, the ghost of its greatest glory and deepest grief. The air was thick with emotion, and the soldiers who carried him could feel it. This was not the burial of a man. It was the coronation of a memory. And as the coffin was placed beneath the great dome of Les Invalides, the crowd fell silent. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had paused to listen. And though the emperor's body had returned, the legend that surrounded him was already immortal. Napoleon had once said, "Death is nothing, but to live defeated and inglorious is to die daily." Standing beneath the echoing arches of the tomb, France understood that he had never truly died. He had simply crossed from history into eternity. Section 7. The Island Today. 2 centuries have passed since Napoleon Bonaparte drew his last breath on the remote island of St. Helena. Yet if you visit today, the air still seems to hum with his memory, a quiet, invisible presence woven into the wind, the cliffs, and the sea. The island remains small and isolated, a speck of volcanic rock adrift in the endless blue of the South Atlantic, halfway between Africa and South America. Few travelers come here by accident. Those who do describe a strange sensation the moment they arrive, a sense that the island is watching them back. St. Helena has changed little since Napoleon's time. The ships that once took months to reach it have been replaced by small planes that land on a narrow runway carved into the cliffs. but the journey still feels like entering another world. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of salt and fern, and the sound of waves breaking against rock seems to echo endlessly, as though the ocean itself remembers the emperor's exile. The locals, a friendly, small community known as Saints, carry a quiet pride in the island's unusual history. They will tell you stories of the house where he lived, the garden where he walked, the spot beneath the willows where his body once lay. They speak of Napoleon not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor, a restless soul who once shared their loneliness. Children learn about him in school. Shopkeepers sell postcards with his silhouette, and the very roads seem to whisper his name as the wind rolls through the hills. At the heart of it all stands Longwood House, Napoleon's final residence. From the outside, it looks modest, almost fragile, a long, low building with green shutters and pale walls, sitting quietly among the windswept grasses. Yet step inside, and the air seems to shift. The creak of the floorboards, the faint smell of old wood and paper, the filtered sunlight through the curtains. Everything feels suspended between past and present. It's as if time has paused out of respect. Visitors describe walking through Longwood as an almost sacred experience. In the dining room, the table where Napoleon once shared his simple meals still stands. The bedroom remains carefully arranged, the small bed, the writing desk, the faint outline of where his books once sat. Even his bath, where he sought relief from illness, has been preserved, the metal tub dull with age. Standing there, you can almost imagine him, pacing the room in silence, lost in thought, his mind still drifting across empires long gone. Outside, the garden spreads quietly in all directions, dotted with tall willows that sway in the Atlantic wind. This was his refuge. Here, Napoleon spent hours tending to plants, watching the sky, and listening to the sounds of the island. He would often walk alone or with a few loyal companions, pausing to gaze out at the horizon where the sea and sky met in a seamless blue. He couldn't see France from here. It was far beyond the edge of the world, but perhaps he could feel it in the wind. Some say he spoke to the flowers as if they were old friends. Others claim he stood for hours by the fence, simply watching the waves. Today, the path he walked has been worn smooth by generations of visitors. Tourists step carefully where he once stepped, speaking in hushed tones, as though afraid to break the spell. Many leave behind small tokens, coins, folded notes, or even single red roses. It's not worship exactly, it's remembrance, the human instinct to touch the past and feel that it still breathes. A few miles away lies the Valley of the Tomb, Napoleon's original resting place before his remains were returned to France in 1840. It sits deep within a quiet ravine, surrounded by willows and flowering shrubs that seem to lean protectively toward it. The tomb itself is empty now, a simple stone enclosure without inscription, but standing before it, you can almost hear the echo of mourning that once filled this valley. The silence here is not ordinary. It has a depth, a weight. The birds sing softly, the wind sighs through the grass, and if you close your eyes, It feels as if time folds in on itself. Many visitors describe it as one of the most peaceful places they have ever stood, not haunted, but profoundly human. A British officer who guarded the site in the 19th century once wrote that the air itself seemed to bow before that grave. Even now, 2 centuries later, the same reverence lingers. Though the emperor's body now lies beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides in Paris, his spirit seems to have left something behind here, an echo of solitude, pride, and unbroken will. Further down the island's winding roads, small museums and plaques mark the traces of his life. The spot where he rode his horse, the house of one of his guards, the place where he first arrived. Each location carries a faint electricity, a feeling of proximity to history that words can't quite capture. Even those who have little interest in Napoleon find themselves strangely moved. It's as if the island itself has absorbed his presence, like ink into paper. At night, St. Helena becomes something else entirely. The stars above it blaze brighter than almost anywhere on Earth, a shimmering ocean of light that seems to stretch forever. There are no city lights to dull their glow. No sound but the distant sea. Many travelers say it's easy to understand why Napoleon often stood outside at night, gazing upward. In those stars, he may have seen his victories, his regrets, his memories of home. In that sky, infinite and indifferent, he may have found the only companion that could not be taken from him, the universe itself. Even today, scientists and stargazers visit the island to study the night sky. They often remark on how the stars here feel closer, not just in brightness, but in spirit. It's as though they carry the same eternal patience that Napoleon himself was forced to learn. A lesson written not in books or speeches, but in the slow turning of the heavens above a man who once ruled the world and then lost it. St. Helena is, in many ways, a living paradox, both a prison and a sanctuary. For Napoleon, it was where ambition met humility. For the world, it became a symbol of how power fades and memory endures. Visitors who leave the island often describe feeling a strange calm, as if the place has quietly whispered a truth to them, that greatness is not measured in victory, but in what remains after the battle is over. And so St. Helena endures, small, green, and forgotten by most of the modern world, yet still holding one of history's greatest ghosts. The emperor who once shook the earth now sleeps in peace, his legacy carried by waves and wind. His presence etched into every stone, every leaf, every echo of the ocean that surrounds his lonely island. Section 8. The Letters from Exile. Napoleon Bonaparte was many things: soldier, strategist, emperor. But in exile on St. Helena, he became something else entirely, a writer. Deprived of his empire, his armies, and his court, he turned to paper. His words, once delivered to thousands on battlefields and from thrones, now fell quietly onto sheets of ink-stained parchment, carried by sea winds to distant shores. What survives of those letters offers us a window not into Napoleon the Conqueror, but Napoleon the man, weary, reflective, and achingly human. In Longwood House, amid the damp air and relentless wind, writing became his refuge, He dictated notes to his secretary, General Bertrand, and sometimes wrote himself, the scratch of the quill echoing softly through the quiet rooms. He wrote to his mother, his brother Joseph, his stepdaughter Hortense, and his beloved Marie-Louise, though her replies, censored or withheld, rarely came. The act of writing, even without answer, became his lifeline to a world that had forgotten him. In one letter, Napoleon wrote simply, "The world is no longer the same for me, yet my thoughts still march across it." He still saw himself as a man of action, yet trapped in stillness. His words carried the rhythm of marching feet, the pulse of memory. Some letters spoke of politics and philosophy, long reflections on the nature of power, justice, and history. Others were tender, filled with longing for his son, the young king of Rome, whom he had not seen since his fall. He wrote, "Tell my son that I loved him too much not to wish he be free of my destiny." That sentence carries a strange mixture of pride and sorrow, a man acknowledging that the crown he once wore was both a triumph and a curse. When his letters reached Europe, they passed through many hands before arriving. British officials censored them, fearing that even his words could stir rebellion or sympathy. They often delayed them for months, and some were never sent at all. Napoleon knew this, yet he wrote anyway. Perhaps he hoped that, if not the letter, then the thought itself might find its way home. The tone of his letters shifted as the years passed. At first, they brimmed with energy, full of plans for books he might write, reforms he might suggest, arguments he still wished to win. He seemed to believe that history was still listening to him. But over time, that confidence softened. The letters grew quieter, more personal. He began to write less about the world and more about memory, about the texture of life on the island, the weather, the sound of the wind through the willows, the faces of his few remaining friends. In one haunting line, he described the sound of the rain on the roof at night. "The rain falls as it did at Austerlitz, but the army it awakens now is only the ghosts of my dreams." There is something profoundly human in that image. The same rain that once soaked his soldiers, now tapping gently above his bed, summoning only memories. For the British officers stationed nearby, these letters were both fascinating and unsettling. They saw him not as a monster, but as a fallen titan, slowly eroded by time and loneliness. Some officers, moved by what they read, began to treat him with a kind of reluctant respect. Captain Nichols, one of his guards, once wrote in his diary, "It is impossible to stand near him and not feel the gravity of his presence, even when he speaks of nothing but the weather." Napoleon's letters from this time also reveal his attempts to shape how the world would remember him. He was not content to be merely exiled. He wanted to be understood. In long dictations to Bertrand and Montholon, he began to construct the story of his life, part justification, part confession. He spoke of destiny, of the burden of greatness, of how the world had misjudged him. In this, he was writing his own myth. He understood that if his body was trapped on St. Helena, his words could still travel freely. Historians sometimes call these letters the Second Empire, an empire of memory, built not from armies, but from ink. He may have lost control of Europe, but he was still trying to command the future. Yet there are also letters that are startlingly simple. In one, he asked for more ink and paper. In another, he thanked a local woman for sending fresh fruit. In yet another, he described the island's flowers, writing that the little blue blossoms by the fence are more loyal to me than men have ever been. Such moments remind us that even an emperor can become a gardener, a poet, a man sitting by a window, watching petals move in the wind. Near the end of his life, his handwriting grew shaky, his sentences shorter. The letters became less about what he wanted to say and more about the need to say something. He no longer wrote to command, but to endure. His final letters, dictated when he could no longer hold a pen, were full of memory. He spoke of his mother's voice, of the snows of his youth in Corsica, of the sunlight over the Tuileries gardens. He asked that his ashes rest on the banks of the Seine, among the people I loved so well. Even then, his words were not grand or defiant, but quiet, almost gentle. After his death, many of these letters were published, passed from hand to hand across Europe. Readers were astonished. The same man who had commanded armies of hundreds of thousands had left behind words that trembled with longing, regret, and beauty. A French poet wrote that in those letters, Napoleon ceased to be a legend and became a man. Today, those letters are preserved in archives in Paris and London. The paper has yellowed, the ink has faded, but if you lean close, you can still see where the quill pressed hardest, the places where emotion bent through restraint. Each line feels alive with breath and silence, with the rhythm of an ocean thousands of miles away. Through his words, we come to understand something deeper about exile, that it is not merely a place, but a condition of the soul, the feeling of being far from everything that once defined you. And perhaps that is why these letters move us still. They remind us that even those who have touched the stars must sometimes learn to live with the night. Section 9. The Final Days. By 1821, the island of St. Helena had already begun to reclaim Napoleon. The endless wind that swept over Longwood carried salt from the sea, dust from the volcanic cliffs, and the faint scent of grass from the highlands. The seasons blurred together in a pale wash of gray and green. Within the lonely house, the man who once commanded half the world was slowly fading, his body thinning, his strength dissolving, his gaze often turned inward toward memories no one else could see. Those who lived with him noticed the change first, in his silences. He began to speak less, even to those he trusted most. Bertrand, Montholon, and his faithful valet, Marchand. Once, Longwood had been filled with dictation, with letters, and the steady rhythm of thought poured into words. But now, the quill rested idle for hours, and sometimes the ink on his desk dried before he touched it. Napoleon's health had been declining for months, perhaps years. He suffered from stomach pains, nausea, and exhaustion. The damp conditions of Longwood, where mold crept across walls and the ceiling leaked in the rain, worsened his symptoms. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, remained wary of him until the end, restricting visitors and correspondence even when Napoleon was clearly dying. Napoleon bore this with a strange kind of resignation. not acceptance exactly, but the stillness of someone who had already fought all the battles that mattered. He began to spend his days in the small garden outside Longwood House, wrapped in a gray overcoat. The same man who once rode among cannon fire now sat quietly among flowers and bees, watching clouds drift above the Atlantic. There was a gentleness in him during these moments, a sense that the island, once a prison, had become almost a monastery. He would stand for long stretches, gazing toward the horizon, and murmur softly, "France, France," as if calling to something that could still hear him. Evenings were quieter still. He would take tea, often with Bertrand or Montholon, and speak not of politics or war, but of books. He had developed a particular fondness for the Iliad and Plutarch's Lives. Sometimes he quoted lines about fallen kings, about honor and fate, his voice low and calm. He seemed to find comfort in stories of those who, like himself, had been both admired and forgotten. Yet even as his strength faded, his mind retained its precision. When visitors came, rare though they were struck by the intensity of his gaze. His once fiery blue-gray eyes had grown dim, but when they met yours, it felt as though he still saw through you, as if some small ember of command had refused to die. In March 1821, the illness deepened. He began to sleep longer, to eat little. His doctors, a French physician, Dr. Antomarchi, and an English one, Dr. Arnott, argued over his diagnosis. Some said it was cancer, others a liver ailment. Napoleon himself believed it to be hereditary. His father had died of a similar illness, and Napoleon told Bertrand quietly one morning, "The Bonapartes die of the stomach." Despite the pain, he maintained a quiet dignity. He asked his servants to keep his uniform clean, his boots polished, and the tricolor ribbons of France folded neatly by his bedside. He wanted, he said, to be remembered as a soldier. On better days, he would sit by the window and ask Marchand to read him the newspapers, still eager to know what was happening in Europe. He smiled faintly when hearing of revolutions and uprisings. "The old world," he murmured, "still trembles in my shadow." By April, he was confined to bed. The room smelled faintly of medicine and sea air. The once smooth walls of Longwood had begun to crack, and the ceiling dripped from rainstorms that swept across the island. Yet within that small space, there was a strange peace. His companions kept vigil at his side, tending to him with quiet devotion. He spoke to them softly, often at night, when the sound of wind outside seemed to blend with his breathing. "Everything passes," he said one evening. "Even glory." He paused, then added, "But perhaps memory does not." Perhaps memory is what outlives empires. It was the kind of sentence that made even those hardened soldiers fall silent. They had followed him through the snows of Russia, across deserts and seas, and now in this damp chamber, they were following him to the edge of eternity. Napoleon began to dream vividly during these final weeks. He told Marchand that he saw himself walking through Paris, the streets empty, the air golden with morning light. Sometimes he dreamed of Josephine, his first wife. She was smiling. He said once, almost to himself, "She forgave me." Other nights he dreamed of battlefields, not of triumph, but of the faces of the men who had died for him. He called some of their names in his sleep, as if counting them one last time. On the morning of May 5th, 1821, the storm that had raged over the island began to calm. The air grew still, heavy with salt and silence. Inside Longwood, Napoleon lay motionless, surrounded by those who had stayed faithful to the end. His breathing slowed. He asked faintly for a crucifix, and when it was placed in his hand, he whispered, "France, army, head of the army, Josephine," and then fell silent. Those were his last words. For a moment, no one moved. The room was utterly still, except for the ticking of the small clock by his bed. Then Bertrand knelt, took his hand, and whispered, "He is gone." Outside, the wind rose once more, not fierce, but soft, like the sigh of the sea against the cliffs. The British guards stood quietly, their hats removed. Even Sir Hudson Lowe, his old adversary, lowered his head in silence. It is said that on that evening, as the sun dipped below the ocean, the clouds broke for the first time in weeks, and a streak of golden light touched the island's high ridge. Those who saw it said it looked like a banner, the last salute to a fallen emperor. He was buried a few days later in a small valley he had chosen himself, beside a spring he loved. He had called it Geranium Valley. No monument marked it then, only simple stones and the sound of running water. 2 decades later, his body was returned to France, carried in a grand procession to the tomb beneath the Dome of Les Invalides. But in many ways, the true Napoleon, the one who dreamed, remembered, and wrote, remained forever on St. Helena, under the island wind. For in his final days, he was no longer the master of Europe, but something far more eternal, a man facing the quiet truth that power fades, but humanity endures. Section 10. The Legacy of an Emperor. When Napoleon Bonaparte exhaled his final breath on St. Helena in May 1821, a strange thing began to happen. He began to grow larger, not in the physical world, but in the world of imagination. The emperor who had once ruled through fear and discipline now ruled through memory. The man who had been confined to a damp island slowly escaped its shores, not in body, but in legend. It began quietly. Those who had served him carried pieces of his story home with them. Anecdotes, letters, keepsakes, impressions. A lock of his hair, a signed book, the memory of his voice. To them, he had not died a defeated prisoner, but a misunderstood hero, a visionary exiled by small men. Within months of his death, poems began to appear across Europe, verses that spoke not of the tyrant, but of the fallen star. Painters began to depict him in a romantic glow, Napoleon in exile, gazing out to sea, thoughtful and noble. The same island that had been his cage became his stage, the last act of a tragedy that would outlive every empire. The transformation of Napoleon's legacy was one of the most fascinating metamorphoses in human history. The very forces that had conspired to silence him, Britain, the restored Bourbon monarchy, the cautious European kings, ended up amplifying his myth. They had sought to bury him in isolation. But isolation made him immortal. There was something irresistible in the image of a man who had touched the heavens of power, only to be flung into obscurity. It resonated deeply with the Romantic generation that followed. To the poets of the early 19th century, Byron, Hugo, and Shelley, Napoleon was not a conqueror, but a symbol of humanity's unending reach for greatness. And indeed, the power of his story lay not in his victories, but in his fall. Before his exile, Napoleon was an emperor. After it, he became an idea, one that could be shaped, reinterpreted, and claimed by anyone. Liberals saw him as a champion of merit and progress, the man who shattered the old aristocracies. Nationalists saw him as the embodiment of destiny and pride. Even his enemies, the British, could not resist the strange magnetism of his memory. In time, the man they had imprisoned became the most visited figure in their history books, a fascination that outlasted their own kings. His legend only grew stronger after his remains were brought back to France in 1840. The Retour des Cendres, the return of the ashes, became a spectacle of national emotion. As his coffin was carried through the streets of Paris, under a canopy of gray clouds and fluttering flags, thousands wept openly. To many, it felt as though France herself had been forgiven. The republics and empires that followed all tried to claim him. Napoleon became a mirror for whatever France wished to see in herself: glory, discipline, ambition, or tragedy. But beyond the politics and the pageantry, his legacy was also deeply human. He was one of the first figures in modern history to be both myth and man, a living contradiction. His achievements were colossal: the Napoleonic Code, which redefined law; the military reforms that transformed Europe; the administrative systems that still shape governments today. Yet behind the grandeur was a person filled with longing and loneliness, a writer, a dreamer, and a man of immense introspection. On St. Helena, he had left behind volumes of notes, reflections on leadership, history, and love. These writings would later reveal not just the strategist, but the philosopher. His mind, even in decay, remained astonishingly clear, capable of dissecting empires as if they were ideas on a page. His story became a blueprint for countless others. Leaders from across the world studied him. Some admired his vision, others his audacity, but all were fascinated by his paradox: a man who rose from obscurity to absolute power, then lost everything to time. Writers and artists turned him into a universal figure, a fallen titan. Beethoven, who once dedicated a symphony to him, later scratched his name from the score when Napoleon declared himself emperor. Yet even Beethoven could not erase the emotion Napoleon evoked. In Eroica, that surge of triumph and tragedy still whispers his name. Historians continue to wrestle with his complexity. Was he a liberator or a despot? A visionary or a tyrant? The answer, of course, lies somewhere in between. Napoleon contained multitudes: ambition and genius, compassion and cruelty, reason and vanity. He could spend hours discussing philosophy, then ride into battle without hesitation. He could speak with tenderness of love, then order armies into the frost. And yet, perhaps it was this contradiction that made him so deeply human. Even now, 2 centuries later, his shadow stretches across history. His life reminds us that greatness is not measured only by power or conquest, but by the mark one leaves on the imagination. To study Napoleon is to study the nature of memory itself, how humans turn fact into story, and story into myth. In this way, he lives not in the marble of Les Invalides, but in the quiet wonder of every person who asks, how could one man have done so much? And perhaps that is his truest victory. For while kings and empires fade, stories endure. And Napoleon's story, like all great ones, transcends its ending. He became, in death, what he could never fully be in life, eternal. There is a line, said to have been whispered by one of his old generals as he stood by the emperor's tomb in Paris years later. We feared him when he lived, but we will miss him for all of time. And that, perhaps, is the essence of Napoleon's legacy. A man who conquered the world, lost it all, and still found a way to rule from beyond the grave. His empire of the imagination will never fall. Section 11. St. Helena after Napoleon. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent and Napoleon's body was laid to rest under the whispering willows of Longwood, the island of St. Helena was supposed to fade into obscurity once more. It was, after all, a speck of volcanic rock adrift in the Atlantic, remote, wind-scoured, and almost forgotten by the rest of the world. But that was not to be, for St. Helena had become something else now. It was no longer just an island. It was a memory, an echo of one man's fall from the summit of the world. At first, the British garrison stationed there tried to return to normal life. The soldiers drilled, the officers dined, and the island's small population of farmers and fishermen went back to their routines. But there was something different in the air, something that lingered. It was said that when the mist rolled in over Longwood House, the simple, damp residence that had confined an emperor, one could almost hear the faint echo of boots pacing the veranda. Even those who had despised Napoleon spoke of the uncanny feeling that the island itself had changed. Visitors began to arrive, though not many at first. Sailors on passing ships asked to see the emperor's house. Some plucked blades of grass or chipped pieces of rock from the path that led to his garden. Others took small stones from his tomb, which lay in a shaded valley surrounded by towering pines and murmuring brooks. These humble relics soon found their way into drawing rooms and private cabinets across Europe. St. Helena had become, in a strange way, a shrine, not of religion, but of history. As the years passed, the island's people began to tell stories. Some claimed that strange lights could be seen near the tomb at night, as if candles flickered where no living soul had gone. Others swore they had seen the ghostly figure of a man in a gray coat and bicorn hat, walking silently through the garden where he had once dictated letters and dreamed of France. The British officers dismissed it as superstition, but even they avoided the path to Longwood after sunset. It wasn't fear exactly, more a reverent unease. The island had absorbed something from the years of exile, something both sorrowful and majestic. St. Helena's transformation was as unexpected as it was enduring. In the decades that followed, Travelers from every corner of the world made the arduous journey to this lonely place. Some came for curiosity, others for devotion. Writers described it with almost sacred awe. Victor Hugo called it the altar of a fallen god. Painters captured its rugged cliffs and wild skies, always with a sense of melancholy beauty. For them, St. Helena represented both the end of a dream and the immortality of that dreamer. Even as Napoleon's body was returned to France in 1840, the island's strange allure did not fade. If anything, it deepened. The tomb, now empty, became a quiet monument to memory itself. Locals continued to tend the garden around it, pruning the same willows and cleaning the path. They spoke of the emperor as though he still lived among them, unseen but ever present. For many islanders, Napoleon had become part of the landscape, woven into the mist and the sea spray. Longwood House, too, took on a second life. What had once been a place of frustration and confinement became a museum of remembrance. Napoleon's desk, his bed, even his worn leather chair were preserved exactly as he had left them. The wallpaper, faded and peeling, still bore the faint patterns he had stared at during long nights of insomnia. His books, hundreds of them, remained stacked neatly, as if awaiting his return. Visitors would walk through the rooms in silence, their footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floors. They would pause before his deathbed and imagine that final breath, the storm raging outside, the whisper of France, the army, Josephine, fading into eternity. But the island itself was changing. The British presence slowly diminished. The soldiers left. The grand fortifications began to crumble. Nature began to reclaim what was hers. Vines creeping up old stone walls. Birds nesting in empty guard towers. The wind that had once carried the emperor's sighs now whistled through abandoned barracks. Yet through it all, St. Helena remained a place of paradox, serene yet haunted, distant yet forever connected to the world through one man's memory. Modern travelers who make the journey today describe an uncanny sensation upon arriving. The sea around St. Helena is vast and endlessly blue, but as the ship approaches the steep cliffs, there is an almost magnetic pull. The island feels alive with whispers of the past. The same pathways Napoleon walked still cut through the hills. The same horizon stretches endlessly before you. The same ocean he once stared into, searching for a France he would never see again. Some say St. Helena still keeps secrets. There are tales of hidden letters buried in the garden, of conversations overheard by servants that were never recorded. Even the cause of Napoleon's death, officially stomach cancer, continues to inspire debate. Some believe he was poisoned. Others say it was the slow heartbreak of exile. Whatever the truth, the island holds its silence. It has learned the art of mystery, just as its most famous inhabitant once did. And perhaps that is why St. Helena endures as more than just a historical site. It is a place where time slows down, where the present feels thin and the past presses close. In the quiet wind, one can almost hear the faint rhythm of a man's thoughts, still pacing through eternity. There's a story told by an old islander of a night when a group of travelers visited the tomb after dark. They brought a lantern and sang softly, a French song of longing and memory. As they finished, the wind rose suddenly, extinguishing the flame. For a moment, they stood in silence until one of them whispered, "He's listening." Whether it was true or not didn't matter. On St. Helena, such moments felt entirely possible. Even now, more than 2 centuries after the emperor's death, the island remains his quiet empire. Not an empire of borders and armies, but of echoes, memory, and sea mist. A place where the world remembers that greatness can fade, but never truly disappear. Section 12. The myths that followed Napoleon's death. When Napoleon Bonaparte breathed his last on that remote island in 1821, the world did not quite believe it. For years, Europe had trembled at his name. Kings had fallen, empires had risen, and the map of the world had been rewritten by the sweep of his armies. To think that such a force could simply vanish into death seemed almost impossible. It felt as though nature itself would resist it. And so, as the years passed, the story of his end began to blur, to twist, to shimmer like a mirage. From the very beginning, rumors rippled outward from St. Helena like waves across the Atlantic. Some said the body buried beneath the willows was not Napoleon at all, that a double had been laid to rest while the real emperor had escaped in disguise. According to these tales, he had slipped away on a passing ship, bound for America or even Asia. Others claimed he was living quietly in Italy under another name, watching the unfolding of history with a wry smile. It might sound absurd now, but at the time it did not seem so far-fetched. Napoleon had already returned from exile once before, from Elba, to reclaim his throne and rally a nation. To those who had seen him rise again, the idea of another resurrection felt almost natural. After all, hadn't he defied fate at every turn? Why not death itself? In Paris, whispers spread through cafes and salons. People leaned close, lowering their voices, and said, "He's alive, you know. The English could never have kept him there. He'll return when France needs him most." It was said with a strange kind of hope, half superstition, half longing. For the world Napoleon had left behind was uncertain, restless. Monarchies had returned, but so had doubt. The ordinary men and women of France, who had once believed in the emperor's promises of glory, now lived under kings again. To them, the legend of Napoleon became something sacred, a story of what once was and what might be again. Newspapers in Europe began to print strange reports. A mysterious man seen in the American frontier, carrying himself like a soldier and speaking with a French accent. An anonymous letter from South America claiming that the emperor lived in secret among exiles near Rio de Janeiro. Even in England, rumors emerged that he was in hiding on the coast, writing memoirs and plotting a peaceful life. Each story contradicted the last, and yet they spread endlessly. It was as though the world needed Napoleon to exist somewhere, anywhere, because the thought of his absence was too hard to accept. And as the legend grew, so did the myth of his death. Was it really stomach cancer, as the British doctors claimed? Or had he been poisoned, slowly, deliberately, perhaps even by his own attendants? Arsenic was whispered, the same poison that left no immediate trace. Years later, Strands of hair taken from Napoleon's head would reveal traces of arsenic indeed, deepening the mystery. But was it murder, or merely the result of the wallpaper in his damp room, laced with green pigment that released deadly fumes? The debate never truly ended. The myths took on a life of their own, reshaping the image of the fallen emperor. To some, he became a martyr, a Christ-like figure who had suffered for the sins of humanity, betrayed by lesser men. To others, he was a tragic hero, undone by his own brilliance, punished not by destiny but by envy. Writers and poets embrace this vision of Napoleon as a symbol of genius imprisoned, of fire trapped in stone. Victor Hugo wrote of him as a titan chained to a rock, echoing the myth of Prometheus, who brought light to mankind and was punished by the gods. The painter Delaroche captured him, sitting alone in exile, head bowed, the shadow of his greatness stretching longer than the man himself. Across Europe, Napoleon ceased to be merely historical. He became mythical. Even in death, he ruled hearts and imaginations. Songs were sung about him. Secret societies invoked his name. Men wore lockets containing a small portrait of the emperor, or a lock of hair said to be his. His name became a whisper of rebellion. Napoleon, a word that could ignite courage, or longing, or defiance, depending on who spoke it. In the countryside of France, old veterans who had once marched under his banners told children stories of the battles they had fought, of the snow in Russia, of the thunder at Waterloo, of the day the eagles fell, and always they ended their tales the same way. He will return. One day the emperor will return. It was a dream, but one that refused to fade. Decades later, when Napoleon III, the emperor's nephew, rose to power, many believed the prophecy fulfilled. Crowds cheered, proclaiming that the Bonaparte star had risen again. In a sense, the myth had worked its way back into reality, shaping the course of politics long after the man himself was gone. But perhaps the most haunting part of the legend was not about politics or prophecy. It was about identity, about how one man's story could become larger than life, even after death. The idea that a single human could be both real and eternal, mortal and mythical, was deeply compelling. Napoleon had become an archetype, a symbol of ambition, courage, and tragic downfall. In art and memory, he never truly aged. He remained forever the general in the gray coat, eyes fixed on the horizon, standing between storm clouds and sunlight. The man who had once conquered half the world was now conquering time itself, living on in imagination, in books, in whispers. And somewhere in the Atlantic, the island of St. Helena sat silent beneath its curtain of mist. It neither confirmed nor denied the stories that the world told. The wind swept over the cliffs, the sea crashed below, and the willows still bent low over the empty tomb. Whatever truth it held, it kept it close, sealed within its stones. Perhaps in that stillness, there was something almost fitting, for Napoleon's greatest victory had always been over oblivion, and even in death, or perhaps because of it, he had achieved what he had always desired most, to be remembered. Section 13. The Legacy of Napoleon's Exile. The story of Napoleon's exile did not end with his death, nor with the myths that surrounded it. In many ways, It truly began there, in the silence that followed him. St. Helena, that lonely rock in the Atlantic, became a kind of shrine, a symbol of everything that is both noble and tragic about human ambition. For as much as Napoleon's empire had fallen, his legend had just begun to rise. When visitors first began to arrive on the island in the years after his burial, they came not as conquerors, but as pilgrims. They walked the same paths he had walked, tracing his steps along the cliffs where he had once gazed at the ocean. They stood beneath the willows that shaded his tomb and felt the stillness settle over them like a prayer. Even those who had once fought against him, British officers, sailors, and diplomats, found themselves moved by the simple sight of that quiet grave. The world had rarely seen such a strange transformation. The man who had once been its terror had become its memory. The 19th century was an age of monuments, and none were more passionately built than those dedicated to Napoleon. His image appeared in marble and bronze across Europe. Statues of him on horseback rose in Paris, Milan, Vienna. Even London carried hints of his legend in the private collections of those who could not help but admire him, even as they claimed to despise him. He had transcended the boundaries of nationality. He had become an idea. Historians and poets began to debate not just what Napoleon had done, but what he had meant. Was he the embodiment of genius or of madness? A visionary or a tyrant? The truth, as always, rested somewhere in the narrow space between admiration and fear. What fascinated people was not only his power, but his fall, the image of the conqueror confined to a lonely island, stripped of his armies, his crown, and his glory. That image resonated across time because it felt deeply human. Every dream, no matter how vast, must one day face its limit. Artists were drawn to this paradox. Painters depicted Napoleon standing at the window of Longwood House, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze lost in the endless horizon. There was melancholy in the brushstrokes, the vast ocean against the small figure, the silence pressing in on all sides. It was the silence of consequence, of reflection, of a man left alone with himself. In that isolation, Napoleon ceased to be a ruler and became something more universal, a mirror of human ambition itself. The island had changed him. Those who knew him during his final years spoke of a man who had grown gentler, more introspective. He spent long hours reading Homer, Plutarch, Rousseau. He dictated his memoirs with the same precision he once used to plan battles, shaping his legacy word by word. It was as though he understood that this, too, was a kind of conquest, the battle for memory. If he could not rule nations, he would rule history, and so he did. When the French government finally brought his body home in 1840, nearly 2 decades after his death, Paris erupted in mourning and celebration. The streets were draped in black and gold, and crowds lined the boulevards as the coffin passed. The emperor had returned, not as a ruler, but as an idea made eternal. His remains were placed beneath the great dome of Les Invalides, where the sunlight spills like a benediction through the colored glass above. Visitors still stand there today, circling the marble tomb in reverent silence. They read the single word carved into the stone: Napoleon. No title, no date, just the name, powerful enough to need nothing more. But perhaps the true legacy of Napoleon's exile lies not in marble or myth, but in the question it leaves behind. How does a man so great, so flawed, so restless, make peace with himself? Saint Helena was the answer. It was there that power dissolved, and what remained was the man, stripped of ceremony, unguarded, human. It was there that he confronted the weight of his choices, the lives his wars had claimed, the empires his dreams had broken. Perhaps in those long hours of solitude, watching the horizon fade into mist, Napoleon finally understood that victory and defeat are not opposites. They are twins. Each leads inevitably to the other. He once said, "Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever." Yet in a way that only fate could allow, his obscurity never came. The man who feared being forgotten ensured, through both triumph and tragedy, that he would never be. Napoleon's exile reshaped how the world viewed greatness. It reminded us that even the most powerful are subject to the same forces as everyone else: time, loss, regret, longing. His downfall became a parable of what it means to reach too high, and what it costs to chase the horizon. Yet it also became a story of resilience, of facing the vast emptiness and still choosing to stand tall within it. And maybe that's why the island still draws people to it. Because in its silence, we sense something of ourselves, our dreams, our failures, our hope that meaning can survive even after the storm has passed. For the island that once held him captive has in time become his cathedral, and the man who once sought to command the world has instead found immortality, not through conquest, but through remembrance. The island, the emperor, and the sea. As the waves continue to break against the cliffs of St. Helena, the wind carries whispers of his name, faint but eternal. The emperor is gone, but the idea of him drifts endlessly, like the tide. His story is no longer about wars or crowns, but about the strange and tender truth that even the greatest among us must one day face stillness. Napoleon's exile is a reminder that greatness is not measured by the battles we win, but by the quiet we endure afterward. He came to St. Helena as a conqueror, and he left as a man. And in that transformation lies his truest victory.